Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gerard Robinson. I am the Vice President for Education at the Advanced Studies and Culture Foundation, located in Charlottesville, Virginia. I am so proud for this to be the second event sponsored by the Center for Education, Leadership, and Culture. It's a new center created in partnership with the Institute for Advanced Studies at the University of Virginia. Our founder, Dr. Hunter, you will hear from him today, and also with the Advanced Studies and Culture Foundation. When we think about culture today in American society, we look through the lens of education, whether it takes place in an elementary, middle, or high school, or at the college campus, where many with the two scholars I have spent a number of years. When we think of education, we understand the importance it plays in the moral formation of young people, what it means to prepare them not only to assume positions of leadership, but also to make sure that they are doing the great things that we know are important. Education is important for thriving, for human flourishing, and for moving ahead in society. Today's conversation will take a look at all of that, focused on one particular theme: race, ethics, and culture. Those three terms have been a part of American society for over 100 years. And for a host of reasons, they tend to be at the forefront of the American dialogue today for different reasons. We know throughout most of recorded human history that education played an important role in the formation of young people and adults until now. And why? We're here to actually understand that. And so today I'm joined by two people who will join me in this conversation. The first is Dr. James Hunter, who is a founder, in fact, the founder of the Institute for Advanced Studies here in Charlottesville, Virginia. And he's also the LaBrosse-Levinson Professor for Social Thought, Religion, and Culture here at the University of Virginia. We also have Dr. Cornel West, who is a professor of practice in public philosophy at Harvard University, and he's also Professor Emeritus at Princeton University. You know a great deal about their work, but you're going to also learn a great deal about them as human beings, and we'll go ahead and get started. And so with that, I'd like to welcome both of you to our webinar.
Thank you, Gerard.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, Dr. Hunter, your book is behind me. We know a lot about culture wars, but for you as well as for Dr. West, who's Dr. Hunter? How did you get started, and what's the path you took to get to where you are today?
I was worried that you were going to say, well, actually, this is an intervention, and we're glad you're here. Well, look, I grew up in a, I think this is mainly a story about confusion. I grew up in a mostly stable middle-class home, and enjoyed the kind of dreamlike oblivion that kind of background afforded. But in the background was the war in Vietnam. And with every year of my childhood, that background loomed closer and closer. This was, the war was, even back then I had some sense of the way in which the war was about the American empire and its ambitions globally. As a 15, 16, and 17-year-old, I was watching older siblings, friends of my older brother and sister go off to war. And it was a real puzzle, a moral dilemma for me. My father fought in World War II in the Asian theater, and my uncle was a spy in Germany. During and after the war, his job was to round up the SS. In my family, going to war was an honorable tradition. But I didn't understand the war in Vietnam. It didn't make sense to me. It was a topic of endless argument with my father. It was a confusing time. And my father was a formidable presence in my life. But it got me to reading, and it was the engagement with the war in Vietnam, perhaps more than anything else, that took me to books, and I read voraciously, and I was raised in a Lutheran tradition, so I began reading Lutherans like Bonhoeffer, like Niebuhr, Kierkegaard, and others as a 16-year-old, 17-year-old. And at the end of that process, I decided that I was prepared to go to Vietnam, but not to fight. And I became a conscientious objector. But it was through that process that I came to understand. It was an attempt to find clarity in the midst of what was personally a confusing time, to make sense of my own life in a context where there were dynamics at play in history and in our society that I had no control over whatsoever. And yet it was also an attempt to engage that world in a meaningful way. And in the process, I think I discovered my own vocation of trying to understand, provide some clarity in times of confusion. So I think that was really at the heart of it.
Thanks a lot. Dr. West.
Well, first, I want to say I'm blessed to be in conversation with my dear brother, Professor Hunter. Thank you, Brother Robinson, for inviting me. And I just heard that that our dear president, Brother Trump, has the virus. I just hope that we could pray for him and his precious family, just like we can pray for all of those who are being victimized by this virus here and around the world. And I say that because it's in some ways, and it's an expression of how I was raised, how I was shaped and molded. That I am my mama's child and my daddy's kid, Clifton and Irene West. I'll never be half the man he was. He died in 1994. My mother's still alive, 88 years young, with an elementary school named after her in Sacramento, California. We were shaped by Shiloh Baptist Church, Reverend Willie P. Cook and Deacon Hinton, and Sarah Ray was my vacation Bible school teacher. And they used to teach us that the kingdom of God is within us, and everywhere we go, we ought to leave some heaven behind. And that was not just a cliche. It's not just a shibboleth. It was a way of being in the world. And it's a reflection of coming from a people who have been hated chronically for 400 years. And yet still try to dish out love warriors, so that Martin Luther King Jr. is not a joke. John Coltrane's Love Supreme is not a joke. Toni Morrison's Beloved is not a joke. And so the sense of being fundamentally shaped and grounded and anchored in a fallible way, in a fallen way, by this love ethic and by the stories that flow out of the prophetic legacy of Athens, of Jerusalem, because Socratic legacies of Athens make a difference too. But the prophetic legacy, especially in my church and in my family, I didn't really encounter a lot of Socratic energy until I stepped outside of a lot of the religious domain. And therefore, I like to have that kind of double consciousness, in which the scientific, the Socratic, the questioning, the interrogating plays a crucial role. And yet there's still fundamental space for faith and hope, and the greatest of those, of love. So that's very much what have been blessed to be as a human being for 67 years in the American empire as a Black man, but at the deepest level, trying to be true to a calling that's impossible to fulfill, but is a joy to pursue.
Both of you mentioned religion, the role that it played in your life. Both of you have talked about social trends and what it meant to you, whether it was based on race, ethnicity, or otherwise. When you hear the term race, ethics, culture, what comes to mind? Start with you, Dr. West, and then we'll go to Dr. Hunter.
Well, in all honesty, I've never heard them put together like that. So I must say it's a tribute to the institute that you have in Virginia. You know, when I think of race, I think of just the human race and the kind of species that we are, as marvelous and as disastrous as we are as a species, going back to the Hebrew scripture. And when I think of ethics, I think of virtues. You know, I think of courage. I think of integrity, honesty, decency. I think of faith, hope, and love. When I think of culture, I think of these structures of values and feelings that are both personal as well as structural, that are existential as well as economic, that are that have to do with who we are as persons, but always shaped by families, communities, structures, traditions, heritages at the same time. And there's evil and good shot through all of them. So every member of the species shot through with the capacity to choose good or evil. Every person of every race, color, sexual orientation, gender, national identity, same thing. And certainly true, every culture that I know, it's tied to some form of barbarism, but also has the possibility of sublimity, of majesty.
Thank you. Dr. Hunter.
Well, I'm one of the things I love about my calling is that I get to read and study, and I never stop learning. And so in a way, I would say that my journey is still trying to figure out those things and the way that they're connected to each other. You know, I would begin, you know, my answer with my intellectual rooting in phenomenology. Now, in social science, in the social sciences, phenomenology is very much on the margins of what we do, but it is a philosophical and methodological starting point for thinking about the meanings that humans impute to their lives. And the question is, the challenge of phenomenology is to understand people as they experience the world. And for me, the importance of it is that it brings me to a recognition that underneath all of the abstractions, like race, ethics, culture, underneath the abstractions of structure, of empire, I mean, you just name it. Underneath all of those abstractions are human beings, real life, flesh and blood human beings. People who are often stupid, but capable of wisdom. People who are often cowardly, but often at times capable of acts of genuine courage. People who are always hypocritical, but at times capable of genuine principle. And people who are almost always self-serving, but at times capable of love and self-sacrifice. And as a scholar, I just have never wanted to lose track of the human being behind our abstractions. Again, abstractions like race and ethics and the like. This approach makes me nervous about certain kinds of words and concepts that tend to be reified, made more real than they actually may be. It's an approach that makes me nervous of simple binaries for understanding the world. Culture, it seems to me, is, you know, so out of this is a framework of meaning and moral order. It's a framework of understanding that's mostly taken for granted, but that provides the context for human action, and not least political action, or public actions in the world. So culture is a kind of structure. And in fact, I would argue it is the deepest kind of structure. It's the deepest form of structure. And culture by its very nature is infused with ethical evaluation. By its very nature, it is, normativity is pervasive. But here I would also make a distinction, because I think that there is, in our late modern world, a grand canyon between our public ethics and our personal ethics. And I think it is, these operate in very different modalities. They operate in very different ways. And it's oftentimes difficult to cross that grand canyon between public and private. They're not oftentimes in conversation with each other. As I think about race, I think about race as such, but it's also hard to extract race from what I think is fundamental to the human condition, which is hierarchy. I don't think that we can get away from hierarchy, and race, particularly in America, represents the hierarchy of caste. Certainly the fundamental contradiction of our political order, but a contradiction that we have addressed, but never even remotely resolved. And so as I think about these things, it is about the combination of thinking not only about structures that are historical, that are incredibly powerful, but also the human beings, and how the human beings that are behind them, within them, shaped by them, but at the same time, not wholly determined by them. Culture, which is itself a form of structure that imposes itself on large mega institutions of our social world, but also on the lives of ordinary people in ways that are, again, invariably normative and ethical. But then race as such, but race within a complex of hierarchical systems that are enduring. So they're not permanent, but they are enduring, but also changeable. And how we, as human beings who live within that world, and I think for us in this conversation who want to engage it responsibly, ethically, wisely, what are the resources that we have available to us to approach that? That's,
you know, what's so interesting is both of you talked about human beings. And when we often use the term human being, we think of it as a subject or a noun. But when I hear you two talk, I hear that we are humans being. It's the verb, it's the action. And that helps us understand things. Both of you wrote seminal works a few years apart from each other. Culture Wars for you, Dr. Hunter, Race Matters for you, Dr. Cornel West. Would be interesting to know two things. Number one, what was the impetus for writing the book? And second, what you found in your book, is it still applicable today? Dr. West, we'll start with you.
Mm-hmm. Well, I first wanted to say, though, that I've got some very deep elective affinities with Brother Hunter, Professor Hunter. I take very seriously the notion of lived experience, which sits at the very center of the great phenomenological tradition from Husserl all the way to Max Schuller to Merleau-Ponty. And it means then there's a dynamism there, there's an unpredictability there, but there's also something that is deeply felt that intellectual categories cannot fully capture. You know, Robert Frost used to say categories are a compromise with chaos, so that the abstraction itself is never going to be able to disclose the richness of the lived experience. And there's something about the species, there's something about we human beings, and as a Christian, I think we're made in the image and likeness of God, that has an irreducibility that can never be fully captured by any human construct. And that ought to generate an intellectual humility for we thinkers and intellectuals and so forth, not stop thinking, but recognize that a distinctive feature of wisdom is to recognize that whatever exercise of critical intelligence we have, it will have its limits. So there's a fallibility that's built in. And so what I've always thought in terms of my own writings is that how do we connect our unique individuality as members of the human species made in the image of God with our acknowledgement of humility and fallibility that then is connected to democracy, because I think democracy is the best we human beings can do to generate mechanisms of accountability given our fallibility and finiteness that affirm our dignity and sanctity as individuals shaped by community. And last but not least, you see, for me, I believe that artists are the vanguard of the species. I believe that that musicians and poets are those who have the kind of courage that Brother Hunter was talking about to tell us painful truths about ourselves and themselves and others. But you start with yourself. It's no name calling and finger pointing. That's not the first move. It's a wrestling with the battlefield that's taking place on one's own soul. That's what the artists are open to. And they take us to lived experience. You see, so there really is more lived experience in Shakespeare than many of the sociological colleagues of Brother Hunter in some ways. I mean, I don't want to go too far in this regard, but there's more in Chekhov, there's more in Coltrane, there's more in Louis Armstrong, there's more in Aretha Franklin. There's something about staying in contact with our irreducible humanness that's always deeper than skin pigmentation and the structures that flow from the categories that we create of gender and empire and so forth. So that's a certain conception of spirituality that is tied to materiality that I'm always about in my writings.
Thank you. Dr. Hunter, your book.
I want to hear more about race matters.
You say what?
Could you say something more about race matters? About the
because Race Matters was an attempt to stay in contact with the humanity of Black folk that has been radically called into question, the irreducible humanity of Black people that's been dismissed and degraded and trashed. But it was tied to this visionary impulse of how do we keep alive a fragile experiment in democracy,
right,
as we come to terms with a vicious legacy of white supremacy that begins not with Black folk, it begins with indigenous peoples, but Black people, we Black folk are at the center of the public imagination because of the fundamental role we have played, our backs being the very basis of the industrial economy, not just in the United States, but in Britain with the Lancashire mills.
That's right.
With the cotton pick taken to the Lancashire mills, allowing Britain to first industrialize as a modern nation. So that Race Matters really began then with this vision. And this is very important to keep in mind because a lot of times people talk about race, they want to jump right to public policy. They want to jump right to the disagreement about X or Y and put, well, no. The poets remind us, as Shelley says, right? Poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. He's not talking about versifiers. He's talking about all human beings who, with imagination and vision, try to generate an empathy so that we can stay in contact with our humanity that leads towards, I think, democratic projects. And so Race Matters was simply a way of intervening with this vision and imagination, informing the discussion about public policy.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. For me, Culture Wars was again an act, an attempt to make sense of the world in ways that our dominant social scientific paradigms couldn't make sense of. The dominant paradigms for understanding conflict for most of the 20th century came out of political economy. It was all about, it was a kind of a materialist explanation about the haves and have-nots. It was about one's relationship to the means of production. And culture wars wasn't an argument that those things weren't important. No, far from it. Culture wars was an argument that there were other dynamics at play besides the dynamics of political economy. And that at the heart of it was essentially an affirmation that culture matters. And at the heart of culture are the normative claims, the kind of metaphysical claims that people make, ordinary people, but people through their institutions as well, make about the world and the good world that they want to create and live within. And at the heart of our ethical claims, in my opinion, and some coming out of the tradition, intellectual and personal tradition, at the heart of those ethical claims is religion. It's our notions of the sacred, of that which is non-negotiable for us. Only the sacred could explain the kind of passion that people were pouring in in their lives into these various issues. Now, most of the issues that I was looking at were issues of, issues of church and state, issues of sexuality, abortion, gay rights, women's liberation, and so on, but also issues surrounding the Supreme Court, about the media, but they were all talked about in very discrete and separate ways. And the argument that I was making was that no, in fact, these things are tied together, and they're tied together historically in a struggle to define the meaning of America. Now, back in the 1980s, when I was doing the research for this argument, it was mainly about an argument that was mainly taking place within the white middle class. Issues of race were important, but they were not of central concern to the white middle class. And what has evolved? I mean, a number of things have changed since 1992, 91, 92, when the book was published. One of the things that has changed is that the culture war is not merely a conflict within the white middle class. It has now become a class culture war. The fundamental division has a class dynamic now, and it is about those who are well educated and those who are poorly educated. And empirically, that plays out with a high school diploma or lower, and a college degree and higher. It is a powerful predictor of where one's cultural politics plays out. The second very fundamental change that's taken place is the emergence of race within the culture war. Because the culture war was always about the struggle to define America, race has emerged finally and inevitably as a story about America's origin, about the contradictions that have always been part, the hypocrisy that was always a part of the American story, and how that hypocrisy gets worked through. It's a concept that I'm using in the most recent work I'm doing. It comes out of a kind of Freudian framework in which the client, the analysee, works through in a conscious way, not through hypnosis, but in a very conscious way, the kinds of contradictions that define ultimately their neuroses. I don't stick to a kind of orthodox Freudian analysis here. I think it would not be useful, but the concept of working through one's contradictions, that's part of what's going on. And it is now, again, enjoined by the larger cultural dynamics of the culture war. And it has been made poignant by the presidency of Donald Trump and the kind of whistleblowing, the kind of racist statements, the kind of permission giving that President Trump has made a defining part of his administration and of his own personal leadership over the last 3.5 years. So those are two very important things. It's in my opinion led to a deepening of the legitimation crisis, which has been ongoing for 50 to 60 years, and it has led us to a place of a kind of an authoritarianism that is, we are on the brink of seeing manifest. It is fundamentally a threat to democracy, and but that's how these things come together, as I see it.
Dr. West, any thoughts?
No, I think that he's hitting some real nails on the head here. I think that we are both an empire in deep decay and decline, spiritually, morally, politically, not militarily. We remain military might, but at the same time, we're a fragile experiment in democracy. America's always had that tension. I talk about this in Democracy Matters 15 years ago. We've always had that tension. We have to be able to keep both ideas in our minds at the same time and retain the ability to function, as F. Scott Fitzgerald put it in the Esquire magazine piece of The Crack Up. And I think it's true. But I think the crucial question right now is, what kind of spiritual, moral, and political economic resources do we have that allows us to meet the crisis of decay and decline? What do we fall back on as that which can enable and empower the best of who we are, or what Lincoln would call the better angels of our nature? You see? And it's here where I would want to challenge my dear brother Hunter a little bit in talking about culture, because I think there's a sense in which when we talk about culture and even religion, that we don't accent enough arts and the quest for beauty, as opposed to primarily the quest for truth and goodness. When you look at the history of the American empire, and especially the history of my own particular Black tradition, that's one tradition among others, it's really the arts that have constituted not just the fundamental domain of preserving one's humanity sonically with the spirituals. You got Black folk, no rights, no access to land, no territory, can't worship God without white supervision, lifting voices. So the sonic confidence and the Black genius and talent in that sonic confidence, because it's not going to be manifest in other places given the massive structures of unfreedom. And it's through this music and also arts in terms of athletic excellence. I consider Muhammad Ali an artist, not just a great athlete, but it's through the arts that the coming together of Black and white and red and other people's humanity has been best affirmed and enacted. One could argue that American music has played a more fundamental role in dealing with the relation between Black and white folk than churches have. Because the blues had already hit white brothers and sisters before the YMCA desegregated. I mean, there's ways in which you can make connections with humanity of other folk, and it's through the arts. And therefore, when we talk about culture these days, we've got to put a tremendous stress on the arts. And this is especially true for our younger generation. I've been blessed to teach in prison for 37 years now. And for most of those young brothers and sisters of all colors, disproportionately chocolate, they're unchurched, they're unmosqued, they're relatively uneducated. Some of them are illiterate. And yet music is the dominant form of transcendence that allows them to come to terms with their suffering and generate structures of feeling and value. And it's through that music that they then are able to open up intellectually and a whole host of other ways to the world, to then make the kind of connections across race and across class and across gender and what have you. So I'm making a strong case for the crucial role, not just of the arts, but philosophically. We can go back to Whitehead. We can go back to Sanayana. These are philosophers who put the love of beauty at the center of their philosophical Weltanschauung. Not just truth, not just goodness, not just justice. And we're at a moment of such decay that if we don't mobilize these resources, we all slide down a slippery slope together. You know, we hang together and hang separately, given this escalating authoritarianism. I mean, I think it's neo-fascist, but I don't want to fight with semantics here. You know, I've been calling my dear brother Donald Trump a neo-fascist gangster for a long time, because I've known him 30 years ago when he was hanging out with Mike Tyson and company. It was very clear that he was a gangster then, so I haven't seen a whole lot of evidence in his transformation in that regard. But when I call him a gangster, I'm not just engaging in name calling, because I know I got gangster in me. I was a gangster before I met Jesus, and now I'm just a redeemed sinner with gangster proclivities. So that when I call somebody a gangster, I'm talking about something inside of me that I got to conquer. And yet I see it in him, the lack of integrity, the lack of empathy, the lack of honesty, the lack of generosity and so forth. And that's something inside of all of us that needs to be conquered. I think most of us do a better job than Brother Trump, but he's still a human being like everybody else.
Well, you're not going to get any argument from me about the importance of art and music. Not even a little bit.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Well, I mean, I think I would put it this way, and again, within the framework of the argument I've been dealing with for the last 30 years, which is that our public discourse, our public culture has been so frozen within the rigid categories of right and left that we lack any imagination for thinking beyond, for transcending those categories of right and left. And the only thing, it seems to me, that's going to get us beyond right and left in these kinds of rigid, ossified categories in the way that we address each other, think about each other in public, is through poetry. It is through art. It is through imagination. It manifests itself. It is literally the only way. And it is then, in a way, the task of the scholar to take those acts of imagination, manifest through poetry, through painting, through music, and to provide a kind of articulation. It's the work of the pastor to bring those articulations to the pew and to ordinary people, of teachers, of educators, to translate those articulations to ordinary people. And it seems to me but it begins with imagination, manifested in the varied ways that you talk about. There has never been a successful movement, certainly in America, to my knowledge, a successful social movement without music. It just doesn't happen.
Very true. That's very true. And recall, the great Martin Luther, who had his tremendous problems in regard to a whole host of things, especially keeping in contact with the humanity of our precious Jewish brothers and sisters. But when he says the two great gifts of God to humankind, the word of God and music. And he democratizes the music within the Christian liturgy. A mighty fortress is our God. He writes that song, right? And the congregation sings, and not just the choirs in the Catholic tradition on the other side of the altar, so that he understood that music as a phenomenon, as understood in a phenomenological way, is able to bring us together and at the same time direct our energies and vitalities, given the barbarities that all of us have, and catastrophes that all of us have to come to terms. Well, this terms was no accident that Plato bans the flute in the Republic. See, that's one of the great tributes of the great Plato to music, just like he bans most of the poets. a great tribute to the poets because it's an acknowledgement of the power of the flute and music, the power of the poets to unsettle the hierarchy that he wanted to set in place. And so you can see he's got deep insights even when he's wrong. And I think that there's something to that. I mean, Lorraine Hansberry, you know, our great genius from South Side of Chicago, Raising in the Sun and other plays, when she rewrites Waiting for Godot by Beckett, and it begins with just these two figures, and they have to engage in enacting the human project all over again. She begins with flute playing because she knows she comes from a people who the music at its best has been the very thing to preserve sanity and dignity and orient their energy in a virtuous way. Now it can go the other way too. You know, music is like any human creation. It can go good or bad. So I think we're very much agreeing about the centrality of imagination and vision tied to the arts. But of course, you know, you need more than that in order to fill out the story about human history. But we, at this point, we're so desperate. We need to look for every resource available to preserve our human connection in the midst of all of these various forms of debasement and dehumanization. And it comes from a variety of different sources. I don't think one political camp has a monopoly on it.
Both of you have spent great number of years of your career working with families. And I use that term in a unique way because working with students at a university, if you influence that student, you're influencing his or her family.
That's true.
You've worked in prisons, you've worked in correctional institutions. Dr. Hunter, you have an institute that you founded. You've helped place over 200 young people into tenure track positions, 71% of those at R1, R2 schools. So you're influencing families through the people you work with. One of the great things that we do here at the Institute is we survey people, human beings, to have an idea of what they want to learn, what they're doing. We recently put together a nice report, Dr. James Hunter, Dr. Carl Bowman, Kyle Putz. It's about moral formation of young people. And they gathered data in partnership with Gallup from 3,000 teens and 3,000 parents from 10 school sectors, public, private, religious, otherwise. And I'm going to share with you a couple of findings and just want to get your response. So for the parents, when they were asked, do you believe everyone has a right to be treated with respect? 79% of the religious families said, absolutely, yes. 64% of the secular said, yes, we believe that's the case. Should we respect people from different groups? 90% of the religious families said yes, 85% of the secular families. As relates to treating people or tolerating people from a different race and others, 87% religious, 90% for the families. So something we would probably understand. When we talk to the teens, the numbers weren't radically different. 86% said absolutely essential or very important, and we treat people with fairness. 83%, everyone has a right to be treated with respect. Here's what's interesting. 45% of the teens said, even though they believe this, and their parents, 45% of the teens said they've actually seen behavior or have heard words that were used in a prejudicial way or a contradictory way to people of different races or other groups. How do we look at what people say? I think, Dr. Hunter, getting to your public-private aspect, Dr. West, some of the things you've talked about the system and hierarchy. How should we think about this?
Well, I think there's clearly a disconnect. I think that parents and young people, their kids, know what they should believe. I think that's one of the things the survey indicates, that they're aware of what they should believe, the ethics that they should hold on to, but they are witness to, on a somewhat regular basis, the violation of those very principles. That to me is a fundamental problem of formation. The backdrop of the work that we've done at the Institute is a challenge in some respects to the dominant psychological models of for thinking about the way in which children grow up. Within the psychological models that have prevailed over the last century, development is essentially a cognitive phenomenon. It can also be a moral phenomenon, but it's essentially an individual experience that children naturally go through. We contest that implicit anthropology, arguing that children are formed. They don't just simply develop autonomously. This is a model, the psychological model is a model that presents a picture of children as essentially autonomous individuals. It is a model that is perfectly suited to our neoliberal economic model, where the highest goal is self-esteem or positivity. Our view is that if we're going to be serious about the ethics of forming children into responsible adults, we need to understand that children are formed within an ecosystem of influences, of families, of schools, neighborhoods, youth organizations, churches, synagogues, mosques, and that those ecosystems bear directly on a concept that Cornel mentioned in the last exchange, which is, what are the resources that we have to offer people that we're going to rely upon? And in this case, what are the resources that we can offer children as they are formed in those early years? It seems to me this is fundamentally a question of formation. In the Christian tradition, this is called discipleship. But we want to use a language that would be inclusive of not just of Christians, but of Jews, of Muslims, of secularists, and so on. We have to take the formation of children seriously, the ethical formation of children, and to understand that as a task of providing resources through the kind of complex moral ecology that's present anyway, but is ignored essentially by the dominant academic models that are out there.
No, I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. You know, when the great Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel gave his lecture in 1965 at Union Seminary, he said the greatest ecumenical movement of our times is nihilism.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right.
And that's why in Race Matters, I began with nihilism in Black America. In Democracy, I said nihilism in America, in high places. Now, what do we mean by nihilism? You know, that's subject to a whole host of different interpretations. But we could say it is a triumph of Thrasymachus over Socrates in Plato's Republic. The claim that might makes right, as opposed to a role for integrity, argument, and persuasion. Or we could say it's the triumph of the Grand Inquisitor over Jesus and the brothers Karamazov, probably the greatest indictment of Christianity written by a Christian novelist, Dostoevsky himself. But the Grand Inquisitor is about what? Domination, manipulation, the use of mystery and authority and miracle to subordinate, to render blind so people can't see the realities of love. Now, in our day, building on Max Weber's talk about the polar darkness that's escalating and the iron cage that he saw in 1918 and 19 before he died, it's wholesale commodification. It's Wu-Tang Clan, cream, cash rules everything around me. And commodification is about what? It's about viewing life as a gold rush. So everybody ends up worshiping the golden calf. Or everybody wants to win the rat race, and the winner of the rat race is still a rat. So there's a spiritual flattening that takes place. There's a moral flattening that takes place. And our kids are bombarded with these every day. And so their way out is through success. And what is success? It's not moral magnanimity. It's not spiritual majesty. It is material prosperity. And so you can just hear, what does it profit a person to gain the whole world and lose one's soul, integrity, distinctive personality outside of the commodification, the obsession with money, status, and so forth. And here we're back to the artist again. You know, we're back to Eugene O'Neill's The Iceman Cometh, the indictment of a civilization so rooted in that kind of narrowness. Or Tennessee Williams, his wonderful essay, The Catastrophe of Success, an essay that I have all of my students read, especially in places like University of Virginia, Harvard, where they've been told from the very beginning, success, success. No, where's greatness? Where's greatness? Oh, I got to be smart. No, let the phones be smart. You got to be wise. What happens to the realm of morality, spirituality that's then colonized by commodification, a whole host of other things? You end up with a spiritual decay. And that's why, I mean, I draw a strong distinction though, and I'll be interested in what you all think. I think we're beyond hypocrisy. You know, LaBrosse-Foucault says hypocrisy is the complement that vice plays to virtue, because at least a hypocrite believes that virtue has some weight and they have to hide and conceal their behavior and act as if they're a semblance of virtue. Whereas gangster is something else. That's what I call Brother Trump a gangster. I mean that, because a gangster has no sense of virtue at all, no standards at all. So that there's no shame, there's no sense of being a hypocrite in that way. They just bold-faced Thrasymachus, bold-faced Grand Inquisitor. Even the Grand Inquisitor had to kiss Jesus in the novel, right? That was a certain acknowledgement. He kisses his bloodless, aged lips. That's a certain acknowledgement. Well, you know, Jesus still moves me in a way, but I got to get him out of the town quick. Whereas a gangster, Mussolini, a Hitler, a Hirohito, and we all know gangsters that we grew up with, they don't give a dang about virtue, don't give a dang. And Trump's the same way. Trump is just so honest about his lack of any moral integrity. That is a fundamental form of nihilism that we're wrestling with, and it leads directly to fascism. I'm sorry to go on so long, but you see.
No, I think you're right. In fact, I would say that there's nothing within the frameworks, the academic frameworks for approaching the moral education of children that would contradict the reigning nihilisms of our day, which is why we have to introduce an entirely new paradigm. Children are embedded within a moral ecosystem, whether they know it or not. And that moral ecosystem is either nihilistic or it's something else.
That's right.
And unless we are deliberate and self-conscious about creating ecosystems that celebrate honesty, virtue, integrity, courage,
That's right.
provide examples for this out of our traditions, the various traditions of our various pluralistic communities, unless we're doing that, they have no other resources except to imitate it.
That's right.
They become the very thing that they are formed into. And there's no other resource. So we do more. That is the challenge of this generation.
I agree. Very much so.
Well, here's the last question before we open it up to the audience for their questions. When both of you talked about nihilism, we know the challenges with it. What is different about the church community or the ethics community? Why are they more, why are they not as involved in discussions of race and of culture today than religious and ethnic communities were civil rights movement or even after World War I and World War II? Because usually this is where they would lead. Not saying they're silent, but just different. What are your thoughts?
Well, if I could jump in first,
Sure.
I would say that I would say that the there are exceptions to the rule. And I would say the African-American church is the dominant exception to the rule here. But so much of white Christianity right now is reflecting the kind of nihilisms of our day in the name, in fact, of resisting the nihilisms of our moment. They actually reproduce through a discourse of negation, through narratives of injury, and the kind of resentment that those narratives of injury foster. Narratives of injury lead to one place, and that's revenge. And to me, that's the heart of the kind of ethical nihilism that we have today. And nowhere is this more present than in the white evangelical community. And this isn't to say that there aren't healthy, vibrant evangelical parishes that would resist these kinds of things. This is not to say that. It's not to say that there aren't evangelical Christians who aren't faith Christians. But as a movement, the evangelical movement reflects, again, through these kinds of cultural logics, it ends up reinforcing the nihilisms of our day more than resisting them.
I mean, one of the distinctive features of the phenomena of religion in the species is that they tell stories that zero in on non-market values. So sooner or later, the churches and the mosques and synagogue, they got to say something about love and mercy and fidelity. Sooner or later, you have to at least give it lip service. Now, even if your praxis is going in a different direction. So at least you have some access to these powerful stories that are always, semantically ambiguous. They can be interpreted so many different ways, but you got to have something to say about it. That's a positive thing. Now, we also know we human beings, we don't have to read Jonathan Swift or the late Mark Twain to know how creative we are in rationalizing and lying about ourselves and evading and avoiding the challenge of love and justice and so forth. And I think the dominant forms of religious institutions, no matter who they are, it could be Muslim, they could be Christian or Judaism, tend to accommodate themselves to empire, structures of evil, and so forth. Peter himself, he's the basis of the church. He denies Jesus 3 times, so it's not a strong foundation in that sense. Now he bounces back, no doubt, and he's willing to die. But it's made very clear that any of the institutionalized forms need Socratic energy. They need serious critical accountability. But in addition, though, I would say this, that even in my beloved Black church that produces, the Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. had 72% of Americans disapprove of him when he died, and 51% of Black people disapproved of Martin when he died, because he went beyond the kind of preoccupation with just Black interests. He knows that any form of tribalism can blind you from the suffering of others. So when he said a baby in Vietnam, back to where Brother Hunter started as a courageous CO, he said a baby in Vietnam, it has the same value as a baby in the South Side of Chicago. So I'm going to give a critique of a popular president, LBJ, who played a fundamental role in pushing back white supremacy as president. I'm going to have an indictment of him. They say, Martin, you're losing your mind. He said, no, I'm called by something broader than just this concern about rights of Black people and civil rights of this hated Black people. I've got a broader view. Now, when I go to a Black church and say, I love my dear brother Barack Obama, but he killed American citizens with no due process. It's a war crime. And they can't see that in part because they're so in love with him. Now, I say, you're going in love. Love includes respect, protect, and correct. And I'm just correcting them at this point. They think I've lost my mind. And I say, no, I'm trying to stay in the same tradition of Martin King and others that have a prophetic witness, a prophetic vision and critique that calls into question the ways in which all of our churches or mosques can be captured by very myopic, truncated moral visions, you see. And the same would be true when you're dropping those drones on innocent folk in Yemen. those babies have exactly the same value as a precious vanilla baby in Virginia, or an indigenous baby on the reservations in Nevada, or an Ethiopian, on and on. Jesus loved little children, all the children of the world, red, yellow, black, or white. They are precious in his sight. I learned that in Vacation Bible School. I am a literalist about that particular formulation. I'm a fundamentalist about that particular formulation, even though I got to push my other fundamentalist Christians going in different directions. So in that sense, all of these institutions stand under judgment, even the Black ones, even though I think you're right, the Black church has certainly done more in terms of pursuing justice tied to race and democracy, but foreign policy, not really. Most of them put the flag over the cross. I come and know every flag is under the cross. Every flag is going to be viewed through the lens of unarmed truth and condition of truth to allow suffering to speak, and unconditional love and justice is that love of what love looks like in public. When you come with that perspective, ooh, Brother Hunter, I'm telling you, you and I can get run out of a whole lot of churches talking that talk. I'm telling you.
One of the great things about Dr. Hunter's work with the National Moral Formation Project is that he's actually pulling up some of the same contradictions, Dr. West, you just mentioned, but showing the importance of institutions and networks and influencing. And when you critique the Black church, Dr. West, and talk particularly about Dr. King, it's tough to understand Dr. King as a different person without the role of a Septima Clark in his life.
That's right.
And the role of a Howard Thurman, two people
absolutely
to fill that. So what we're going to do now is turn it over to the audience for questions. All you have to do is push your, raise your hand electronically. I can tell you right now that your picture will not appear on the screen. We'll just see a blank screen with maybe your name. Just two things to ask a question. Number two, don't give a speech. So first we're going to turn to Andrew Lynn, and please identify yourself. Where are you from?
Hi, I'm Andrew Lynn. I'm here at UVA, a postdoc at the Institute. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I just had a question about looking at educational institutions as a means of overcoming some of the racial resentment and racism that we see. How can that be done in a way, looking at those institutions as morally formative, in a way that doesn't just reproduce polarization and some of the sharp divides around what education is in this country, and then also religious versus non-religious institutions? How do we avoid just polarizing attitudes toward race based on what institutions taking that role?
Thank you for the question, for both of you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I would begin where Professor West left off, and say that the heart of our educational mission must be to teach a radical and defiant humanism, the kind of radical and defiant humanism that draws. That's a capacious humanism that draws from various traditions, that is not simply an Enlightenment humanism or the kind of reworked humanism of mid-20th century. This is a new and a kind of critical humanism that affirms the fundamental dignity of all human beings, the inviolable dignity of all human beings. How to institutionalize that is a different question, but it does seem to me that this radical defiant humanism has to be the foundation of what we teach children, and that our democracy and that a humane society depends upon it, and you go from there.
Absolutely. See, I think education at its deepest level, what the Greeks would call paideia, is very different than cheap schooling here now. This is deep education. predicated on the formation of attention to get people to attend to the things that matter. We know the pioneering work of Tim Wu, the attention merchants, with the aim of Marcus and others is to gain the attention of folk and keep them distracted. We are distracted from distractions by distractions, T.S. Eliot says of Bert Norton. That's what it is to be part of modern culture. The cultivation of a moral sensitivity that has to do with empathy, that cuts across nation and race and gender and so forth. And then it's the maturation of a loving soul or a loving person. So our education has to highlight the exemplars.
Yes.
It could be Dante in exile with a bounty on his head. Where does divine comedy come from? It could be Descartes in exile. It could be Nelson Mandela in jail. It could be Fannie Lou Hamer getting beat down and yet still dishing out all this love nobody understands. You're not supposed to understand it on a certain level. It's foolish in the eyes of the world, but she's still loving anyway. Those grand examples in our formation, especially of the children, especially of the young folk coming through, and then finding joy in it. Now, I'm gonna go further, and I hear this with my own Christian sensibility, but we have to recognize that the quest for moral and spiritual greatness is tragicomic in character and cruciform in content, which is to say, if you're going to be the courageous one, like Socrates, then you got to get ready for some hemlock. If you're going to really follow Jesus, then you can't evade the cross. If you're going to really take Martin Luther King seriously, you don't take him seriously when he's safe and contented. You got to take him seriously when they're trying to bomb his house, when they're lying on his family and so forth. If you're not ready courageously, spiritually equipped for the tragic comic witness of exercising all that's inside of you, the kenosis, the emptying all that's inside of you, all the gifts that you have been given to dish out to others, and then be willing to be crushed or misunderstood. And I say cruciform because, of course, we won't get into my thick doctrine of evil, my thick Christology, that you got to be willing to live and die in that way. And that's a high, high standard. It's an overwhelming standard for all of us. And yet it's still worth the effort and the quest.
Thank you. Got a question from Anthony Bennett. We can't hear you. Your mic is still mute, Mr. Bennett. All right, we'll come back to Mr. Bennett once his mic is now unmuted. Okay, so let's go to Anna Kim.
Hello, greetings from London. I can't tell you, James and Dr. West and Dr. Robinson, this is kind of a dream conversation that I've been wanting to hear for many years, and it's so inspiring to me. I want to return to what you said, Dr. West, about the importance of art and beauty in these times, because as James knows, that's my role at the Institute, to articulate why this is central to the thriving of communities, to civic agency, when traditionally the arts and culture have been seen as, something elitist, something that is at the top of needs, other needs that need to be fulfilled first, right? I and others have tried to argue that individuals and communities have a fundamental right to beauty, precisely in order to cultivate this imaginative vision about what it means to be human and what might be possible. We know what happens in the absence of beauty in slums, in other forms of removal. We know the kind of limitation of human capabilities that this kind of deprivation leads to. So here in the UK, we've begun making arguments around the idea of creative citizenship and cultural democracy. that are based upon the realization that fundamentally one of the greatest assets that we have here is our soft power and recognition of world-leading culture. So that it comes in part from an economic argument, but nonetheless, we've begun thinking about.
Anna, I'm going to need you to ask a question only because I'm being
Oh
respectful.
yeah, yes. Sorry. So yes, supporting cultural infrastructure here so that every person has the ability to become a creative citizen, which seems to me so necessary. What do you see in the US? I mean, I've been involved in creative placemaking movements, but as an academic, how do you see supporting these kinds of capabilities and capacities for everyone in the face of media and the way that it directs our young people?
Thank you, Anna.
Mm-hmm. Well, the United States, in stark contrast to most European countries, we don't have massive state-supported arts programs. And so we have to have civic institutions. Our churches have to be as tied to prison ministry as opposed to their building fund, as well as creative activity among the young peoples, so that they're creating beauty. They appreciate it and they create it. And appreciating is always a very important step, because see, when you dumb down the education, it becomes a matter of just, the entertainment is just about bodily stimulation and titillation. No. Arts are not about just titillation. They're about learning how to care, learning how to nurture. They're about learning how to listen. They're about learning how to give yourself. So that in that sense, we have to have civic institutions in the United States that put a high priority, including our university, because our universities are dominated by STEM sensibilities, and they downplay the beauty of mathematics. It's all about manipulating various entities as opposed to learning how to give themselves.
In response, Dr. Hunter?
Well, no, I mean, I'm mesmerized by Cornel's remarks, and I would just echo that though the world seems to be spinning out of control, this is an opportunity. This is an opportunity that we need to aggressively step into with this, and it will require courage, and it will require sacrifice, because the establishment institutions are all about protecting their own interests. They are not oriented toward innovation. They are responding defensively to the problems rather than organically and creatively. But this is an opportunity, and it's an opportunity that in which everything is at stake. It all matters. And so, the kind of civic engagement with the arts and the ways in which the arts need to be integrated with the formation of the young is absolutely a crucial task.
We have a question from Howard Henderson. Okay.
Dr. West and Dr. Hunter, I really appreciate the great conversation. I am a criminologist at Texas Southern University, Historical Black College. And, right now we're battling criminal justice reform around the country. My biggest concern is that we don't speak enough about the culture within which the criminal justice system exists, and we focus on the individual. Could you speak to the challenges of understanding the culture within which our criminal justice system was created and how that hampers our ability to solve the problem?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Deep question. Brother Hunter, you want to jump right in? I'll come right after, though, man.
This is why I'm an academic, because I love to learn. I don't know enough to be able to speak to that. It is absolutely a critical question. And it is, in my opinion, it is the question that surrounds criminal justice. It is culture in the most capacious sense. It is the ways in which we think about the frameworks of meaning and moral order that surround this institution, that draws from the resources of history, of literature, of moral philosophy, the only adequate answer to your question would draw from those kinds of resources, and I just don't have the facility to do it. But I do want to say that is the right question. You're posing exactly the right question. Thank you for doing that. I'm sorry that I can't help.
And I would say the same thing. That is the $65,000 question. We started with talking about culture. Now we're talking about the culture of the communities from whom people have themselves victimized and victimizing each other, and the communities of the police departments, the communities of those on the other side of town. But I would accent this, you know, the great Reinhold Niebuhr says in the Moral Men and the Moral Society, any justice that's only justice soon degenerates into something less than justice.
Mm-hmm.
This is very important.
That's right.
Very important, because see, justice itself can become an idol that forecloses or trumps the genuine care and concern we have to have for each other. See, indifference to evil is more insidious than evil itself. Indifference is the one trait that makes the very angels weep, William James says. And he's right about that. The cultures from which they come, there has been policies of indifference toward their healthcare, indifference toward their education, indifference toward their jobs with a living wage. You see, the callousness, and then the indifference to each other. Indifference is the thing that needs, and the same is true in the police department. You got the good police. They're not saying a mumbling word about their bad police who out here killing folk, because you got this silence. And the silence is nothing but a species of indifference. This takes us right back to nihilism again, right? This sense that you can make it through life concerned only about your own individual, truncated, egoistic agenda and project, and be callous and indifferent to other people's plight. That's where the role of prophetic witness, prophetic vision, prophetic education, not in a self-righteous way. We got to be like jazz folk. If you don't learn how to listen, you're going to be playing those same chords you played when you were 17. You haven't grown or matured. You're going to have to go back and listen to somebody who listened. That's what Monk told Coltrane, right? You've been imitating Johnny Hodges too long. You learn how to listen to find your voice, and then lift your voice like the anthem of the people from which you come, who've been Jim Crow, but never allowed Jim Crow to have the last word. That indifference needs to be shattered, and that is a human thing all the way down.
All the way down. Well, I would add one other thing very quickly, and it would just be to hearken back to, you know, one of the ways I think about culture, which culture at its heart is provide the frameworks of meaning and moral order, and also of imagination, within which all human activity and all human institutions operate. Not least our politics, but also not least our criminal justice system. If our criminal justice system is broken, it's because the culture that underwrites it is broken.
That's right.
So you have to begin with an understanding of what human flourishing looks like, which comes out of different traditions. Certainly the Christian tradition, the Jewish tradition, and elsewhere. But it is what does human flourishing look like against which a broken system can be measured? And so again, if the system is broken, it's because the culture itself, the frameworks of meaning and moral order and of imagination, those are broken. That's a way of reframing your question, and it absolutely deserves pursuit. Thank you for asking it.
So we'll go to the last question I can take this time. Is Anthony Bennett, I believe this time we have him.
Is this the same brother who was having trouble with his technology?
I think I got it now, Doctor.
Oh, that's good.
Hey.
That's it, Brother Robinson. He's not just asking high quality questions, but he's got a sensitivity to your predicament, my brother.
Thank you,
Lovely.
Doctor. I appreciate it. I appreciate it. Greetings, Dr. West and Dr. Hunter. I'm going to be quick. Given this conversation, can either of you or both of you speak to what you believe would be the component parts of seminary curriculum for those clergy persons, aspiring clergy persons, those who need to recalibrate themselves to be courageous prophetic witnesses in this moment?
Thank you for your question.
Cornel, you're going to be far better at answering that question. I'll add my 2 cents at the end.
Well, I don't think seminaries are that much different from any other institution of education. You got to be tied to a quest for truth, goodness, beauty, and it's got to be self-critical. It's got to be Socratic. The only difference is that seminaries, we Christians, we have the audacity to say that we believe that our quest for truth is going to be deeply shaped by these particular narratives coming out of Hebrew scripture and the Koine Greek that focus on a Palestinian Jew named Jesus, but recognizing he comes out of the prophetic Judaic tradition and recognizing, in fact, that he is in a historical moment that we have to be able to reconstruct and make sense of. But then we bring that in conversation with the best of the physicists, the best of the biologists, the best of the psychologists, the best of all of those who are part of the larger conversation. And so again, it's going to be a matter of integrity, honesty, decency, courage within the seminary. And if you got a commodified church, then you're going to have a problem because you're just going to fit in for your job. It's not going to be too much concerned about beauty and truth. It's going to be about your station, your status, and whether your church can be a mega church. And we're not concerned about mega churches. We want to know how much mega courage, how much mega love, mega sacrifice you got going on in your church. Those are the criteria, it seems to me. So in that sense, I know various seminaries are wrestling with this, but I don't want seminaries to think that somehow they off in the ghetto or somehow they off in a different space. All of us are in this ghetto together called spiritual decay of the American empire that has a great history and at the same time has an ugly history simultaneously.
I would add this, that higher education in America at the end of the 20th and at the beginning of the 21st century exists in service to a technocratic regime. And therefore its education is technocratic. And my sense is that in seminaries too, the kind of education that you receive, whether it is in the Bible or in scripture, or whether it is in ministry or psychology or in church administration, it's all oriented toward a kind of technocratic approach to credentialing. And what's missing, if you'll allow me to say it, is the kingdom of God. It is this vision of human flourishing, because when you come out of a seminary and are and land in a church, it seems to me, again, as that you're to do exactly what Dr. West described at the very beginning of this seminar. You are to embody and carry with you a bit of heaven wherever you go. And so as a pastor, you are to lead a community that is in its institutional form, in its human relations, in its worship, in it, to reflect the kingdom of God, that vision of human flourishing, a world that is, but is not yet. And that, it seems to me, is lost in a kind of technocratic approach to seminary education. It may, an alternative may exist here and there, but it strikes me as the exception, at least in my weak understanding of these things. But I don't know, is that a fair assessment?
I think you're speaking the truth, brother. I don't see any weakness at all there. You're telling the truth. We always leave room for those prophetic institutions and professors and so forth, but there has been a kind of hegemony of the technocratic forms. I wouldn't even call it education, brother. I call it schooling. You know what I mean? I want to hold on to paideia and build on at that high level of spiritual formation and moral formation that goes hand in hand with scientific skill acquisition and so forth.
That's right.
Well, Dr. West, Dr. Hunter, first of all, let me thank you for a very enlightening conversation. You did a great job of helping us focus on our theme, which was race, ethics, and culture. Dr. West, good to know that you hadn't seen those three put together that way. And Dr. Hunter, I want to thank you for your vision, because without what you started here at the Institute, there would be no Center for Education, Leadership, and Culture. I'm Gerard Robinson, Vice President for Advanced Studies Culture Foundation. Thank you for joining us. Go to the website for the Institute for Advanced Studies and Culture. Take a look at our events. We always have great events going on monthly, and we'll see you again. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.